The notice had been taped to her door with ordinary Scotch tape. That detail bothered Miriam more than she could explain, not stapled, not slid beneath the threshold with some gravity, just taped there like a grocery flyer or a reminder about recycling day. 31 years in the same apartment, and this was how it ended. Scotch tape. She read it twice, standing in the hallway in her house slippers, the ones with the worn-out right heel she kept meaning to replace. The building had been sold. The new owners were converting it to short-term rentals. Tenants had 60 days. 60 days. She folded the notice carefully, the same way she folded everything, corners matching corners, and went inside to make tea. Not because she was calm, but because at 81, Miriam Delacroix had learned that the body needs something to do when the mind goes very, very quiet. She sat at her kitchen table with her cup and looked at the window. Outside, it was a gray November morning, the kind that doesn't commit to rain but doesn't pretend to be anything else either. The bare oak across the street stood perfectly still. She thought about her father. She hadn't meant to. She hadn't thought about him seriously in years, not the way you think about a person rather than a memory. But something about the notice, the abruptness of it, the impersonal tap of Scotch tape on painted wood, made her think of him. Of the things he used to say. Of the thing he left behind. The Airstream. The storage facility was 40 minutes outside of the city, past 3 traffic lights that seemed to exist only to slow down time, past a gas station that sold live bait. Past a field of harvested corn that looked like a crew cut on pale skin. Miriam drove slowly. She always drove slowly now, not from fear but from the recognition that speed was a habit, not a necessity. Her daughter, Cecile, had offered to come. Miriam had said no, thank you. This wasn't stubbornness. It was instinct. Some things you approach alone first, before you let anyone else's reaction shape your own. The storage facility was called Anchor Self-Storage, which Miriam found oddly poetic for a place full of things people couldn't let go of. A young man at the front desk, no older than 25, handed her the key with minimal ceremony. She had been paying the annual fee through automatic withdrawal for 43 years. She wasn't even sure when she'd set it up. It had become like breathing, something happening in the background while the rest of life moved along in front. Her father, Raymond Delacroix, had owned the Airstream since 1959. He'd bought it used, from a man outside Baton Rouge who was moving to a smaller life, he said. Raymond had never taken it anywhere. That was the thing people always asked about when they learned of it, where did he take it? And the answer was always a little embarrassing to give, nowhere. He parked it in his backyard, and then, when he moved into a smaller house, into storage. He kept paying for the space until he died in 1981. Then Miriam, without quite deciding to, simply kept paying. She walked the long concrete corridor to Unit 14, her footsteps echoing in the particular hollow way that empty spaces hold sound. She had visited twice over the decades. Once in 1994, when she'd briefly considered selling it. Once in 2003, when Cecile had asked to see it, out of curiosity about her grandfather. Both times, Miriam had unlocked the unit, looked at the trailer, and relocked without going inside. It felt like something that wasn't ready yet. She wasn't sure what had been waiting. She wasn't sure she knew even now. Unit 14's rolling metal door went up with a sound like a long exhale. The Airstream sat where it had always sat, aluminum skin gone the color of old pewter, rivets spotted with rust at their edges, the rounded body intact but humbled by time. It was smaller than she remembered. Childhood things always are. She stood for a moment in the threshold of the open unit, not stepping in. The Airstream had been her father's quiet place. On Sunday mornings, when the house was still asleep, he would go out to it with a thermos of coffee and stay for an hour. He never said what he did in there. When Miriam asked once, as a girl of maybe 10, he had smiled in that way he had, the smile that held something back, and said, "Just thinking, Cher. Just thinking." She'd believed him because she'd had no reason not to. Now she pressed her hand to the aluminum door and felt the cold move through her palm. She was 81 years old. She had no home after 60 days. Her daughter was worried. Her knees were stiff in cold weather. She had approximately 4 boxes of belongings she cared about in the world. And she was standing outside a rusted Airstream in November, 40 minutes from the city, asking herself what her father had been doing in there all those Sunday mornings. She turned the handle. The smell was the first thing: dry paper, aluminum warmth, something faintly like cedar, and underneath it all, something she couldn't name but recognized the way you recognize a person's walk before you see their face. It was him. 50 years later, and it was still him. She let her eyes adjust to the dimness. The small windows were filmed with age but still let in gray light, which lay flat across surfaces like a second layer of dust. The interior was not empty, as she had expected. She had imagined, vaguely, on the 2 previous visits she hadn't fully committed to, that he'd kept little inside. A chair, perhaps. A side table. The folding kind. What she found instead was a life lived inwardly. Along one wall ran a narrow built-in shelf, and on it sat rows of composition notebooks. The kind with the black and white marbled covers, the kind that schoolchildren use. She counted 9 of them without moving from the doorway. Then she stepped in and counted more on the shelf above, 14 total. And on the fold-down table bolted to the opposite wall, 3 more, these ones with rubber bands around them, tight enough that the rubber had long since hardened and cracked. Raymond Delacroix had been a quiet man. A Creole from Opelousas who had come north for work and stayed for love, which was how he always described her mother: "I came for work and stayed for love." He'd worked 32 years at a printing company, setting type in the early years, managing workflow in the later ones. He was not, by any ordinary measure, a man who wrote. He'd never mentioned keeping a journal. He'd never spoken of anything he composed. At his funeral, the pastor had called him a steady and quiet man, and the congregation had nodded because it was exactly right. Miriam sat down on the narrow built-in bench, the vinyl cracked but holding, and picked up the nearest notebook. The date inside the front cover was March 1961. She would have been 19 then, away at school in New Orleans, studying to become a librarian, which she had become and remained for 38 years. She turned pages slowly. Her father's handwriting was small and precise. He had been a typesetter, he understood the weight of letters, the value of space. The entries weren't dated beyond the first page. They weren't, exactly, a diary. They were something else. She read for a while before she understood what they were. They were letters. Every entry began the same way: "Dear Miriam." Or sometimes, "Dear Cecile." Or occasionally, "Dear both of you." Cecile, her own daughter, hadn't been born until 1963. Raymond had been writing to a grandchild who didn't yet exist. Miriam held the notebook in both hands and felt something shift in her chest, not painfully, but the way a door shifts when it finally finds its level after years of being slightly off. She looked at the shelf of notebooks. 14 years. From 1961 to 1975, the year her father's hands had started shaking, the year he would have found small writing difficult. 14 years of Sunday mornings. 14 years of letters to his daughter and the granddaughter he was already imagining into being. She opened the second notebook. Then the third. She wasn't reading carefully yet, she was mapping, the way you move through a house you've been told about for years before you enter it. She was understanding the shape of it before she understood the contents. And then she stopped at a page near the middle of the fourth notebook, dated, this one specifically dated, October 14, 1965. Cecile would have been 2 years old. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, Cher. I don't know if I'll ever tell you it exists. But I've been putting something away. A little every month. Your mother doesn't know the full amount of it. It's not deception, I want you to understand that, it's more like planting. A man plants something and doesn't announce it to everyone. He just tends it and waits. Miriam's hands went still. She sat with that page for a long time. Long enough for the gray light from the filmed windows to shift slightly, the way November light shifts, not dramatically, not into brightness, just into a different shade of gray. A little every month. She thought about her father's salary. Modest. She thought about the house they'd lived in, the furniture that was always just sufficient, the way her mother had sewn her school clothes every August rather than buying them. Not from poverty exactly, but from the particular economy of people who came from very little and kept that knowledge close. She thought about how she had gone to college on a partial scholarship and a small loan, and how her father had given her $200 the morning she left, which was more than she'd expected. Which she had not questioned because you didn't question gifts. "I've been putting something away." She got up and walked the length of the Airstream slowly. There was a small storage area at the far end, beneath the built-in bunk that had never, to her knowledge, been used for sleeping. The latch was a simple hook and eye, gone to rust but not seized. She worked it open carefully. Inside, a metal box, the kind that hardware stores sell for storing documents. Green, with a handle on top. Not locked. The clasp opened with simple pressure. Inside the box, a savings book from a bank that no longer existed, its cover worn smooth, and a rubber-banded stack of what appeared to be certificates. She lifted them out carefully. As you'd lift anything that age had made fragile, and saw, even before she unfolded them fully, that they were savings bonds. She counted them sitting cross-legged on the aluminum floor, which was cold through her slacks, her back not thanking her for the position. She counted them twice. 47 savings bonds. Her father had been buying savings bonds since 1961. Small denominations, $25, $50, purchased with the kind of regularity that spoke not of wealth but of absolute intention. Some were made out to her. Some to Cecile. Several were made out to my grandchildren, which struck her with a tenderness she wasn't prepared for because her father had lived to know only Cecile, had not lived to see the others. He had been buying bonds for people who didn't yet exist. She laid them out on the narrow table and sat looking at them. 47 bonds, purchased between 1961 and 1975. She didn't know their current value. Bonds matured and then kept earning, or some did, depending on the series. She'd have to have them checked. But that wasn't the part that held her. The value of the bonds was not the thing her hands were shaking about. It was the savings book. She turned its pages carefully. Monthly deposits, small, sometimes very small, $8, $12, $15, entered in a teller's handwriting. The ink faded to a brown that might once have been blue. The account was in her father's name. The last entry was November 1980, the year before he died. At the bottom of the final page, in her father's precise typesetter's hand, someone, him, had written 2 words that were not a teller's note, for later. Not for emergencies. Not for anything specific. Just for later, with the faith of someone who knew that later always came, that the people you loved would eventually arrive at a moment when something extra would matter. She sat on the floor of the Airstream and let herself cry quietly. Not loudly. Not with her whole body. The way you cry when you're 81 years old and you've had a lot of practice with loss and you know that grief and gratitude are not separate things, they are the same water in different light. She drove back to the city without the radio on. She needed the quiet around her. The harvested cornfield passed on her left, the bait-selling gas station on her right, the traffic lights changing without urgency. She had the metal box on the passenger seat, strapped in with the seatbelt because she wasn't sure what else to do with it. At home, still home, for 59 more days, she made soup, because making soup was the closest she knew to prayer. She chopped carrots with the methodical patience of someone who had done this 10,000 times. She let the onions go translucent in the pot. She put in thyme from the small pot on the windowsill, the one Cecile had brought her 2 Christmases ago. She called Cecile at 7 o'clock, after the soup, after the dishes. I opened the Airstream, she said. A pause. Then, and? He'd been writing to us. For years. Letters, in composition books. And he'd been saving. Bonds, and a savings account. She paused, finding the next words. He knew, Cecile. He knew that someday something would be needed. Another pause, longer. How could he know that? Miriam looked at the kitchen window. Dark outside now, her own reflection looking back at her. He didn't know the specifics. He just knew the shape of a life. He knew that we'd be here eventually, at whatever here turned out to be, and he wanted to have done something about it before we arrived. She could hear Cecile breathing. Adjusting to what she was being told. We need to have the bonds assessed, Miriam said. Some may be expired, some may still be earning. I don't know. I'll call the bank about the account, though the bank doesn't exist anymore. I'll have to find out who absorbed it. She said this with the librarian's instinct for knowing that records exist somewhere, that you simply have to know where to look. Mom, Cecile said softly. Are you okay? Miriam thought about the question. Her kitchen was warm. Her soup had been good. She had 60 days in a metal box and 47 bonds from her father and 14 composition notebooks she hadn't finished reading. I think I'm more okay than I've been in a long time, she said, and meant it, though she couldn't have fully explained why at that moment. It was something about understanding that she wasn't standing in the present alone. That there were hands behind her, invisible, patient, having prepared the ground before she knew she'd need it. She went to bed at 9:30 and lay looking at the ceiling. Her father had died in March of 1981. He had never mentioned the Airstream's contents. Not once. She had asked him, late in his illness, if there was anything she should know, anything he wanted to tell her. He had looked at her with that held-back smile and said, "You'll be fine, Cher. You've always figured things out." She had taken it as comfort. She understood now it was also information. He had trusted her to find it when she needed to. He had trusted time itself, the particular way that life eventually brings you to the thing that's been waiting. He had not said, "Look in the Airstream." He had simply made sure that when she was finally ready, when circumstances finally pressed her toward it, what was there would still be there. 50 years of annual storage fees. 43 of those paid by a daughter who didn't know what she was preserving. A chain of small decisions, none of them dramatic, all of them faithful. She thought about the word patient before she fell asleep. About how patience was not just waiting but a form of love, love extended forward into time you wouldn't live to see. Arranged carefully so it would still be standing when someone arrived who needed it. She spent the following 2 weeks reading the notebooks. Not quickly. 15 or 20 minutes each morning, with tea, at the kitchen table, before the day's practical concerns, the calls about the bonds. The research into dissolved banks and their successor institutions, the quiet conversations with a housing counselor Cecile had found, began their work. The letters were unlike anything she had expected, because she hadn't known what to expect. They were not grand or sentimental in their language. Her father had been a typesetter, he'd spent his working life in service to other people's words, and this seemed to have given him a plainness in his own, a trust in direct statement. He described things. He described what he saw and what he thought about what he saw. He described Tuesday evenings and the particular smell of the printing shop in summer and the way her mother, Edna, looked when she laughed at something unexpected. He described the neighborhood they lived in and how it changed. He described small mistakes he'd made and what he had learned. He described, in a notebook from 1967, the savings bonds. "I've been buying them for 6 years now," he wrote, "and I haven't told your mother the full count because she'd worry it was too much, that we were sacrificing present comfort. We aren't. I'm careful. But I want there to be something real, not advice, not good wishes, something real and tangible that you can hold in your hands. Advice is cheap. Wishes don't buy anything. Your grandfather on my side left me a pocket watch and a pair of boots, both of which I still have and neither of which has ever helped me past a hard moment. I want to leave you something that helps past a hard moment. She read that passage 4 times. Then there was a letter from 1969, she would have been 27, recently married. Cecile a toddler, in which he described watching the moon landing on their small television set and thinking about the distance between things. About how far people travel towards something without knowing exactly what they'd find. That's what saving is, he wrote. Traveling towards something without knowing what it is. You just keep going, steady as you can. In 1972, he wrote about worry. Not dramatically, but honestly. He worried about inflation. He worried about whether bonds were the right vehicle. He wrote that he'd asked someone at the bank and had been told the bonds were sound. And he believed the bank person because what else could you do? You made the best decision with the information you had and then you tended it. Tending was a word that appeared several times. He tended the savings the way he might have tended a garden, if he'd had a garden. With attention, with adjustment, with faith in the eventual. In 1973, he wrote about Miriam. You are 31 now and I am 58 and I notice that I see things in you that I didn't plant, things that simply came from somewhere and grew in you. And this is the greatest mystery of a parent's life, that the person you love is also a stranger, is also completely their own. I don't say this with sadness. I say it with something like wonder. You became yourself and it is magnificent, share. Even the parts one don't understand. Especially those. She put that notebook down and sat with both hands around her teacup for a long time. He had been 58. She was 81. She thought about the reverse of what he'd written, about the mystery of a child's life, but also the mystery of a parent's. That she had lived with him for 18 years and not known this person who spent Sunday mornings writing composition notebooks. That a person could be so genuinely, privately themselves. She thought that it wasn't sad, exactly. That it was what he had said, something like wonder. The bonds, once assessed, had appreciated significantly. Not transformatively, not life-altering in a dramatic sense. But enough. Enough for a deposit on a small rental in the neighborhood she liked. Enough for a cushion against the uncertainty that 81 carries in its pockets at all times. The bank account, traced through 2 acquisition chains, yielded a smaller amount. Interest had accrued in some years, not in others, but it was real money. It was her father's carefully tended money, arrived at exactly the moment it was needed. She thought about the word enough. About how it was the most underrated word in the language. The new apartment was on the 4th floor of a building 12 blocks from the old one. It was smaller. It had a window in the kitchen that faced west, which meant evening light fell across the counter while she cooked, which she found she loved immediately and deeply. The way you recognize something you'd always wanted without knowing the specifics. Cecile helped her move. They made 3 trips in Cecile's car. Miriam had been ruthless about what she kept, not from grief or hardship, but from the clarity that sometimes comes when circumstances require you to distinguish between what you carry and what carries you. She kept the composition notebooks. She kept the metal box, though the bonds were now filed elsewhere, properly. She kept the savings book with its brown ink entries and its 2 final words, for later, at the bottom of the last page. She framed it, actually, this took some thinking about, some deliberate decision, and hung it in the kitchen near the window that faced west. Cecile stood looking at it the first time she visited the new apartment. He never said a word, Cecile said. No. Why didn't he? Why keep it secret all those years? Miriam stood beside her daughter, looking at the framed page. She'd thought about this question since November. She'd turned it in different directions, tried on different answers. I think, she said slowly, he didn't trust words to carry it. He trusted the thing itself. She paused. Or maybe he knew that if he told us, it would change what it was. It would become a gesture you were aware of, something he got credit for. This way, he just did it. He just did it for 43 years and let it be what it was. Cecile was quiet for a moment. Then, that's either very humble or very lonely. I think it's both, Miriam said. I think most real love is. She had, in the previous weeks, begun rereading the notebooks more carefully. She'd made notes, the librarian's instinct still alive in her. She was thinking about what to do with them, not publish, nothing so public as that. But perhaps transcribe them. Make careful copies. Give one set to Cecile, keep one herself, put one in a library archive that accepted family papers, where someone might someday find them useful for reasons neither of them could anticipate. Her father had trusted the future with things. She thought she could do the same. The new apartment smelled like fresh paint for the first week, and then like her cooking. And then like itself, the particular mixture of old building and new occupancy that a place develops when someone settles into it with intention. She arranged her things slowly, taking days to decide where certain objects should go. Not from indecision but from attention. She wanted to know where everything was. She wanted the place to feel considered. On the first Sunday morning in the new apartment, she made tea and sat at the kitchen table and did not turn on the radio or check her phone. She sat in the early light, which was winter light, thin and clean, and she thought about her father sitting in the Airstream with his thermos on Sunday mornings. She thought about him opening a composition notebook and writing "Dear Miriam" at the top of a page, writing to a daughter who was somewhere else entirely, living her ordinary and unknowing life. She thought about how much of love is exactly that, directed towards someone who is elsewhere, who doesn't know it's happening, who will only understand it later, or perhaps never. Or perhaps on a gray November morning in a storage facility 40 minutes from the city, standing in front of a rusted Airstream that has been waiting 40 years for the right moment. She picked up a blank notebook, she'd bought a stack of them, the composition kind, the marbled black and white cover, and opened it to the first page. She thought for a moment about her grandchildren. 3 of them, Marcus, who was 28 and worried about money in the way young people worry, which is all of the time. Diane, who was 24 and still figuring out what she was figuring out. And James, who was 15 and had his great-grandfather's precise quality of attention, the way he looked at things carefully before touching them. She thought about James especially. About the person he was becoming, the one none of them fully knew yet. She wrote, "Dear James." Then she paused, watching the winter light come in sideways through the kitchen window. She thought about what to say first. There was so much. There was always so much, and the strange economy of love is that you never say enough of it in the ordinary run of a life. Because the ordinary run is full and busy and everyone is present and it seems unnecessary, seems excessive, seems like something there will be time for later. For later. She thought about the bond a person made across time, not the legal kind, the kind that paid out in money, but the other kind. The kind that was made of patience and attention and the faith that the people you loved would arrive eventually at whatever later turned out to be. And that something of you would be there to meet them. She wasn't sure how long she would have. She was 81. She knew the arithmetic of that. But she had notebooks. She had Sunday mornings. She had the particular clarity that comes when you finally understand what someone spent a lifetime showing you. She put pen to paper. What no one tells you about inheritance is that the most significant things are never listed in a will. They aren't listed anywhere. They wait, in rusted trailers and composition books and savings accounts nobody knows about, with the patience of people who understood something about love that the rest of us are still learning. That it does not require acknowledgement to be real. That it does not diminish in the dark. That it was never about the moment of giving, which the giver might not live to see, but about the moment of receiving, which the giver trusted would come. Miriam Delacroix moved into her new apartment at 81 with 4 boxes, a metal tin, and 14 notebooks her father had kept from her for half a century. She was not, by any measure, starting over. Starting over is a young person's phrase, with young person's energy underneath it. What she was doing was something older and quieter, she was arriving. Arriving at the understanding that the ground beneath her had never been as uncertain as it felt, because someone had moved quietly through the decades tending it. Not removing the difficulty was real, but preparing for it. Believing in her enough to believe in her later. She still has the savings book, framed in her kitchen, where the evening light falls across it. For later. Maybe that's all love ever really is, something planted in a moment you're living through, intended for a moment you can't yet see, held in trust by time itself. And maybe the truest question any of us carries isn't whether we were loved, but whether we were paying enough attention to recognize it when it finally arrived.